Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Cyber Risk Engineering. With us today, Dr. Earl Crane, who's going to talk to us about the balanced attacker model. Um, just some standard housekeeping rules. So, like previous, we're going to run this YouTube live event for 45 minutes. We're going to leave ample of time towards the end for Q&A. So you'll have a chance to come back with any questions that you might have, and we'll try to answer those after the 45-minute mark. And with that in mind, without any further ado, Dr. Earl Crane, welcome.
Thank you, Giannis. Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about you, Earl.
Well, I've been in the cybersecurity profession for 20 years, and like most people, we've been around here for a long time and quickly fell into the interest in cyber policy, governance, risk management. And after joining a startup for a while called Foundstone, I got a call from Homeland Security. And so I spent 10 years in federal government. And while I was there as the director for cyber strategy at Homeland Security, I was the chief information security architect. During that time, worked on my PhD at George Washington. And then I've been teaching at Carnegie Mellon for almost 20 years now in various cybersecurity courses. And so now I provide cyber risk management consulting services and virtual CISO services driven with a platform-enabled risk management solution.
Impressive curriculum, Earl. So welcome again, and good to have you on board. So tell us a little bit about the balanced attacker model. I know it's a card deck. Of course, it represents a lot more than just a card deck. What is it?
So when I did my doctorate work at George Washington, I focused on the function of eusocial engineering and eusocial systems. So these are self-organizing, self-defending networks, in my case, inspired by ants. And I realized that that was a really complex topic to try to describe when talking about risk management and having a risk management function and keeping those items in balance, because the way a eusocial system works is based on the inputs that it has. It has different types of outputs, and it lets those be varied. So that means an enormous permutation of possibilities, which is very similar to what we deal with in cyber risk management. And so I realized that a card deck was a way to communicate it more easily.
And how did you come up with this card deck? What's it made out of, and how do we use it?
So the card deck is really just a simple modeling solution. What the card deck provides is a way to explore various loss scenarios. And so it's very similar to what you would have in tabletop exercises and wargaming exercises, where the risk managers and the leaders need to think through all the different types of loss scenarios. Well, if we think of eusocial animals, ants do not have to think through every type of scenario they're going to come into. Are they going to get flooded? Are they going to get eaten by anteaters? Is some child going to show up with a magnifying glass and go at them? Instead, they're able to deal and survive with whatever scenario they're presented with. And they're when you talk about survivability and resiliency, they're one of the most successful species on the planet. And so they do all of that by interactions and resultant outcomes. And so that's where this card deck allows us to do scenario discovery to then figure out how should we react to this, and do we have the right systems in place to deal with a large permutation of different bad events.
Right. So when did you come up with the balanced attacker model?
So after my doctorate work, we took it out into a company called Emergent Network Defense, and we then shortened it later to Emergent. And it was a great time with a great run, a lot of great people, and we were working to build a software solution to do this modeling, this type of scenario modeling.
Okay.
What we discovered was the computational power just wasn't there, the complexity just wasn't, or the capability to understand all the complexity wasn't there. But in discovering how we needed to communicate this swarming intelligence, that's where the card deck came in as an easy way to
Right.
explain it. And so what started off as a marketing tool to try to explain complexity of risk management is one that I've been able to incorporate into a number of classes that I teach at both Carnegie Mellon and at University of Texas at Austin in their law school. And so that's it's gone through a lot of iterations since then. But the use for a modeling card deck is one, and card decks have been shown in a lot of different ways to be an easy way to communicate complex topics.
I remember going through this with you, probably in one of our first meetings when we first met a few years back, and thinking it must have been really difficult to take, all the concepts around cyber risk modeling and kind of distill them into, 52 cards effectively, right? And of course, we'll be going through demonstrations for our audience and showing how we cover parts of NIST as well. But before we do any of that, in your experience, when it came to people, using this deck as you were developing it and evolving it, Earl, how did they actually end up using the cards? Was it just a case of drawing them out? What was the primary use case for the deck?
So the primary use case is education.
Okay.
And it's used for discovery because we're able to identify stuff that we didn't previously know, and we're able to talk about something in a tangible way by physically holding cards that represent risk, which is inherently intangible. So I'll give an example. I was teaching at the law school at University of Texas at Austin just yesterday. And so this was a group of L3 law students that are not particularly technical. They certainly, some of them are very technical. Some of them have very technical engineering backgrounds and others don't. And so I need to be able to communicate the concepts of cyber risk management to an audience that's varied from, there's a mechanical engineer, there's computer scientists, there's materials engineers in there for patent law, to very traditional non-technology focused, they have history backgrounds. But across the board, they're able to understand these high-level concepts of attackers, of assets to protect, of controls to put that in place. And it really changes once you get into some games. Like the energy in the room shifts from, okay, I kind of get this, to I'm going to beat you. And that's where the interesting stories show up.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. So assets, threats are all part of the card deck. Shall we do a quick demo? Shall we look at how the card deck looks and what it's made out of?
Yeah, let's get into it. And I've got a couple slides that I use as an introduction.
Yep.
Right, that I can share here. And like I was just saying, one of the things that sets games apart from other types of communication mediums is that we're able to shift in these cards both for, or we're able to use these to address both very technical audiences, right? And so here I am at RSA, ran into Kevin Mitnick at one of his shows and showed him the card deck and say, hey, here's what we're doing. Makes sense. And then on the other side, it's one of my co-creators and playing it with his son, right? And so I've got pictures of people like to play this with their kids or their spouses. because you can start it relatively easily and start to discuss cyber risk modeling. Do you want me to go through a couple of these slides now?
Oh yeah, please. And what I love about this is the simplicity of it, right? The fact that you could go through it with a young student or a kid, but at the same time you can have a discussion about it with the likes of Kevin Mitnick or more technical folks. So that's really good. So let's look at the progression of risk management and how we start. Are we going to start with an asset?
Yep. So first we start with assets. And in the program, in the courses, we talk about these as our crown jewels, identifying what are your most valuable assets. They vary for all different types of organizations. And so we have a number of different assets where we're able to show those and be able to get into those. And so then we have our, let's see, and I might actually be able to show it here. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Show some of those different assets. Then we have from those assets we apply different controls. And in this deck, using the NIST Critical Infrastructure Framework with identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And then those assets are targeted by threats. And so those threats and the strength of those controls and the strengths of those threats have to be kept in balance. Because if you do too much, then you're not being cost efficient. You do too little, you haven't properly protected your assets. And so that's keeping all of these items in balance is one of the key outcomes of this discussion.
Brilliant. So basically, it's the whole asset to threat being protected by a control, and then having the discussion around, as you said, right, the educational aspect, the what if scenario, and trying to plan for that. Very good. Very good. So if we look at then, you mentioned NIST and you mentioned, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. How does that tie into the actual business attacker model deck, the BAM deck itself?
So the mechanism in the BAM deck for applying the NIST model is one that can actually work with any number of different control frameworks. I've created versions of this with the CIS, top 18 CIS controls. I've created versions with custom sets of controls. And it's really how are you going to balance and use those? But the critical thing with all those controls is we get to resource exhaustion. We only have so many controls that we can apply. And it's a matter of being judicious in how we apply and making sure controls are effective to be able to defend and beat the game to succeed in defending our assets.
Absolutely. We only have limited resources and they must be used in the most efficient possible way. So we get a little bit of information about the deck. Shall we look at an example?
Sure. So let me pull up a view here. Let me make it a little bit brighter in here as well. There we go.
So take us through the colors of the different cards that we see. Well, first of all, why are they hexagons? Let's start with that.
So one, because the printer, we were able to get it that way, but the hexagons also allow us to arrange them, there we go, in a way that we can start putting them right next to each other, right? So we can start lining them up, and it's one that just starts to allow different ways to put all those together.
Right.
So I've only introduced 3 cards, 3 of the sets right now. So that's what we'll look at, which is the assets. Those are the ones in yellow. Mm-hmm. Then there's the threats that are in blue. And then we have our NIST cards that go through the series of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover for those different colors.
Right. Right.
And so there's a number of different ways to play, but one that is particularly easy that I like is that we talk about building a loss scenario. And so we can build a loss scenario in a relatively straightforward way where it lets us bring the different cards together and combine those together. And so I can show you what that.
Let's look at an example. Can't wait.
What that would look like. So one way I usually like to do this is I say, show me. We go ahead and pick a card. So if you're playing with this with someone, and you randomly draw out a card.
Okay, so we're picking an asset, right?
Yep. So we're picking out an asset. Here we go. One that's kind of fit here would be like an employee. So the asset, assets are people, process, and technology. So this is one that would be an employee. I drew documentation earlier, which we could also certainly apply that as well. There's also some that are in here, technical elements and non-technical elements. But now we're going to have an attacker that's going to target our asset of people as an employee. So we'll pick one. In this case, it's an insider. So now we have a scenario where we have an insider targeting our employees.
Right.
And that's something that we can understand would happen. Then we have to think about, well, what do we have in place that's going to protect them, and what's going to fail that means that we wouldn't be able to protect them. And so one way of developing that, if an organization has implemented the NIST framework, for example, a number of these controls, if not all the controls, should be in place in one mechanism or another. And so if we pick one in this case, it would be around the one I randomly picked was supply chain risk management. So I'll ask you, how could an insider compromise your supply chain to target an employee's security?
Oh, interesting. I can see that scenario now. Yeah. So they would the insider would somehow obtain access to information about a supplier, and then they would misinform, ill-inform, hide that information from the employee who's responsible for processing part of that information. And therefore, a link would be created between the insider, the supply chain risk, and the actual employee who's falling victim, if you like, to this attack.
What I like there is you actually, I don't know if you know it, you said 3 scenarios all at once. You used the word get access to, and so we're skipping ahead a little bit, but I can show it. That would be a loss of confidentiality.
Right.
You said manipulate or change, and then that would be a loss of integrity. And then you also said might be able to, I think you said either delete or remove or not make available. And so every one of those is a different type of attack scenario, every type of loss scenario, where that insider may be manipulating data or going through that third party to get information from that employee, to manipulate information that employee has that they get through the supply chain, or make it unavailable. And so what we usually do is we take the next part of the scenario here and pick one of those 3 consequences, a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And so now we have the beginnings of a scenario that we can include in a tabletop assessment.
Got it. And of course, the hexagon makes that placement of the different consequences much more closely aligned, because you've got more sides than, let's say, a square. So that makes sense. It wasn't just the printer, right, that did it.
Right.
Very good. So you go through and you build out scenarios by picking cards. When does one scenario complete? Is this now one example that we can say is done and dusted, and then we go and pick a new asset? Earl, how does that work?
So this is an element from the cybersecurity side of it. But as we know in risk management, it doesn't really mean a lot until we tie it to the business, and that's business value. And so that's one of the things that differentiates this from a lot of the other types of card decks or different types of scenario modeling, is we need to make it something that's important to the business, talking to the risks that are identified in the risk register. And so the way we have that is we have the last set of cards here, and these are our risk cards. That's why they're red. And so our risk cards line up to the different types of losses: a loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And there's two different ways that we play through this one. And one is that we can draw randomly a card. And so this one that I would draw randomly would be your market risk. And we would call this a minor incident, because what we're saying, oh, actually not a minor one, that one, we'll go with this one. We call this one a major incident, and I'll explain that in a minute. So a major incident, because in the game way, we're identifying that market risk is something that can be impacted by integrity. So if an employee is about to release important information and you've manipulated it, that loss of integrity could impact the market and the organization's standing, and if it's publicly traded or stock value, or it's those various elements of it. So there's we're also able to, and I highlighted as a minor, right? Let's go with as a minor incident, and that would be, for example, on reputation. So in this case, we highlight confidentiality and availability can be impacted with reputation from an integrity perspective, not from a market risk, because that's different. But if an employee or an individual releases information that might not be correct, yeah, that can certainly impact the overall reputation, but that happens frequently as well in organizations. So we highlight that as a minor risk, because there's not a match between integrity and reputation. And because you could certainly argue, well, that's not, it doesn't always apply, and that there is a component of that, but it lets you start to differentiate how much should I be worried about this final incident or this incident scenario as it impacts my business.
And that makes sense, right? Because very often you have a technical risk that is immaterial to the business, and vice versa. You have a business risk that is can be seen as oblivious from a technical perspective, but actually, if it materializes, has a downstream business impact that can be huge. So it makes perfect sense. Are there any other elements? So we've got the yellow, that's the asset. We've got a specific type of control in purple. We've got the threat. We have the consequence, and we also have the if you like, the outcome from a business perspective. Are those it? Are those the constituent parts of the deck?
Well, they are. I think it's helpful to highlight, if I go back to my slides, say from the NIST framework. Right now, we're only talking in identify. So identifying risks or impacts or manipulations could happen through your supply chain. But at the same time, if we go through and look at the other components of protect, detect, respond, recover, anytime we talk about a failure in one of those different types of controls, the scenario changes and it becomes a different type of discussion. So if I go back to my deck here, and let's say we're no longer identify with the supply chain, we're talking about protection, and we're talking about IDAM, identity management, authentication management, access control.
Right.
So now the failure isn't going through a third party, but it's internal, where the insider is able to get access to the employee's information, elements about there, to still continue on the program with this attack scenario. Why this might make a difference from a tabletop assessment is we just removed the vector of a supply chain or third party in that conversation. So one, we're talking about the strength of our vendor risk management program. Now we're talking about the strength of our internal access management program.
So straight away, you can almost substitute or take out the different constituent parts that formulate your cyber risk in question. And by that, you get, I think, what you described earlier as the room wakes up and kind of, starts brainstorming on the different types of risk that's there. I think that's brilliant. if we look at this specific example, we've spent sort of, I don't know, 10 minutes or so on it. What does an engagement look like for educational purposes? Let's say that we're going through building scenarios. Are we looking at something that's likely to last, I don't know, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month, 1 week? What sort of
This
timeline?
is done in a tabletop. Yeah. So this you can do, and what's fun is at the bar. One of my favorite things to do back
Right.
before COVID is when we would be out at a security conference and we just sit there and whoever you're sitting next to is some kind of security professional, and you ask them, "Hey, have you ever had this happen to you?" And you draw the cards at random, and or you would ask them to draw the cards at random, and they would, and it always varies based on the order. It varies based off of how you play it, which is just like real life. It has so many variables you can't model all of them. So people always play differently too. So sometimes you'll have them pick the asset first, and now they're more defensive. Sometimes you'll have them pick the attacker first, and now they're thinking about all the different ways that attacker can manipulate. And walking
Mhm.
through those, it's interesting because some people will show it to you, and some people keep it to themselves. And just the personality gets revealed of the individual you're playing with how they build the scenario. So that part's fun, all the way up to half a day, day long training and awareness sessions. You can do modeling um, with I've had it used at large um, telcos where they use this working with their developers to discuss different types of loss scenarios that they might be
Okay.
concerned with as they walk through threat modeling exercises, all the way to during cybersecurity awareness month and using it to just make people aware of either the risk management program that you have, say if it's through NIST or another, or the types of attackers that you're concerned about.
I think it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because not only have you distilled really complex concepts into, a card of 52, sorry, a deck of 52 cards, but also you've managed to articulate the supporting frameworks that come through on that. And I can see that we received a question on social media regarding the use of NIST versus ISO that we'll come to at a later stage. So for everyone else that's watching us, please feel free to either on the live chat or through social media come back with any questions that you might have. Okay, so looking at this whole experience, if I can call it that, um, it's very well put together. And not only are you able to use different frameworks, but you're also able to articulate otherwise complex risks. Now, we've just done a simple demonstration of one risk. What sort of games can come out of playing this deck with this deck that are actually, a little more than an articulation that happens behind the bar? What more can we do with this deck, Earl?
Well, sure. Let me show this, which is quite popular, right? Is just applying this game like war,
Hmm.
and so you can use just the one deck with two people, and it's fun because you can play it simply with someone that just sees the higher numbers, or more complex as you start to build it, and the strategy starts to reveal itself as you describe will and someone how will they defend and how will they attack. So it starts simply where the defender here draws a single asset card,
Okay.
and so that would be one of the yellow cards, and and they draw one asset card, and then they take one or two controls from the control deck
Hmm.
to then defend that card. They don't know what the level is going to be of the attacker yet. And then when the attacker goes and they draw from the other side, if the attacker is greater than the sum total of the defenders, the attacker captures that asset. And so that asset is a point. So, or
Right.
5 points in this case. And if the number is equal to or less than the defenses, then that asset has been protected. And so you go through and you play this game until you either run out of assets or you run out of controls. And if you run out of controls before you run out of assets, all your remaining assets are compromised. And if you have any controls remaining at the end after you've protected all your assets, those get counted as points as well. And so you also get to capture that. And whenever you play an asset, it then goes into, or play a control that goes into the discard pile. And so we were doing this in my law class yesterday. Or actually, this one was a week ago, and they really got into it. That now I'm getting pictures of people playing with their kids and such like that, because here we're able to build this out and build out this type of scenario that, on one hand, you could just be looking at numbers, right? But on the other hand, we can talk about this happening in real life. Like the card deck that is up on the screen is a user error causing a disruption on your network resources. And so mitigating that both by having protective technologies on there and having a risk management strategy so that user errors have less of an impact.
Right, right. So effectively, for those that consider cyber risk modeling a complex process, and nobody was born knowing it, right? We start off by taking the numeric value of threat versus sum of controls, which is quite simple, right? Simple game of war, as Earl has described it. And then based on that, we go through and interpret and say, oh, okay, this threat is a 5 versus this threat, which might be a 7, versus this threat that might be a 3, and do an equivalent exercise for the controls and the asset, of course. And that means that by osmosis, people playing the game get to learn more about the competitive nature of different threats and also the skill set that they might have behind them, etc. And at the same time, what sort of competence the controls might have as well. I think that's brilliant. A game of war that is based on the NIST framework and really counters threats to controls. Just you mentioned 2 controls, Earl, versus 1 threat. So how does that work? Is it just that the numbers are skewed in that way for there to be more than 1 control?
Yeah, it's just kind of how the numbers work out and the way that the game is structured. But if you were to play only 1 control, let's say if you had a lower valued asset and you only wanted to deploy 1 type of control on that one, it lets you preserve your resources for later on versus deploying 2. If in that game, if you let the player put as many controls down as they want, then they exhaust all those controls by the end. And so they'll inherently lose because there's still assets that need to be defended at the end.
Right.
They've run out of resources because they overspent in the beginning.
Got it. So you also learn about the reality of protecting assets versus the myriad of threats out there. So if we look at, so then we have the simple educational let's say, use case of this deck. We have the game of war. When it comes to using this in an enterprise, and you gave some examples, but when it comes to actual enterprise cybersecurity, other than those 2 use cases, how else can the specific deck and the respective balanced attacker model benefit an enterprise?
Well, so one of the ways that I've been able to structure this is a more sophisticated game, and I actually have a placemat for it that you can download from my website as well. Kind of inspired by Pokemon Go, where you lay cards out on that placemat, and what it does is it operates through a series of successive waves of attackers, and it's a facilitated engagement where you have teams of people at various tables making decisions on how to defend, and as it goes through multiple rounds, those individuals work together to beat off the attacker. And so at the end, what's interesting is you're then able to talk about what's the strategy that they used. Sometimes their strategy is to deploy the highest value asset first with the highest value controls, and
Right,
so
right.
following defending your crown jewels with the greatest amount. Sometimes they want to do a preservation strategy where they only make a limited smaller value of those controls available. And so we do a lot of those analogies in real life as well. When we talk our regular risk mitigation strategies of avoidance, acceptance, transference, and mitigation, we're basically doing that same type of decision making, and this brings it into a game scenario.
Yeah. We'll include a link to the PDF file of the Placemat that those that want to download or print it and really practice it a little bit. And I think that Placemat example and discussing strategy is also very important in the context of seeing your enterprise as an organization that, as Earl, as you said, is going to be attacked over and over again by a succession of waves of different types of attacks, and then based on that, seeing how you can best defend with your resources. So that's enterprise cyber risk management with Placemat and just taking the game of war to an elevated strategy level. Can we do any simulations?
Yeah, so effectively what we're doing when we're playing through these iterations are a series of different simulations. So say, and we say, for example, going back to the scenario that we had here, an insider compromising an employee through a failure in data security.
Mm-hmm.
As we're able to start building out different types of attackers, for example, and this is what one of the things that shows up in some of the more complex games, is we start getting more sophisticated attackers. So in this case, you have an insider taking advantage of a natural disaster. So it's happening at a greater strength, and we see this happen all the time when there's elements under duress, when you have weather storms, when you have
A nation
different types
invading
of
another
areas.
nation, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly right. Yes, it's so for that one I'd have to get out my nation state threat card, for example, right? And so now you have state sponsored with natural disasters, or I guess what you're actually experiencing is the insiders would be those in some of the breakaway regions, right? And then state sponsors working with them. So it increases the strength of the attacker. And so then you need to start becoming more sophisticated in your defenses. And so you can start looking across the NIST framework, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and use that to start building out a layered defense. So in this case, just picking some of the ones from the top, you're looking at a data security program, and enhanced mitigation, risk mitigation controls, and minimizing the risk in your business environment, identifying what the assets are and the risks within that business environment, and then rearranging or shifting that around so to reduce the exposure within different business units. So you're able to then iterate through all these multiple different scenarios as you build through it. And what's helpful is why we do that in the first place. Humans are really bad at imagining the unknown. And so this is a function of bringing the unknown unknowns into something that we do know. And so by walking through different types of loss scenarios and different types of elements, we're able to discover new areas new risks that need to be mitigated that we might not have previously considered.
Yes, and understand that risk landscape a lot better. What I liked about that example right there is that you got me thinking, just by lifting one of the threats and just putting it further down, you got me thinking about the combination of that threat scenario in a completely different way, the kind of way that you would potentially look at it in a simulation or in a tabletop exercise that emulates incident response, or something similar there. And all you did was just literally pick up a card and just move it one hexagon down. So it definitely works in practice. If we look at the overall educational aspect, the simulation and the exercises, the cyber enterprise risk aspect of using the balanced attacker model, and the corresponding deck that comes with it. What do you think and we'll start taking questions in a second, but Earl, I wanted to say, what would be a next version of this deck and concept, if you like, for you? What would version 2.0 look like?
I like that you bring that up because we actually didn't talk about this one at all, and this was something that I just stumbled into with some of the students at the latest class. I'm a real fan of collaborative games, and currently the structure is one that's very competitive. It's the attacker versus the defender, and you have to have a player on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But there's increasingly collaborative games that are becoming very popular. They have been around for 10 years or so, but rather than traditional games that are adversary based like chess and poker, right? There are collaborative games. One that I'm a fan of is called Pandemic, where you have to beat the game by working together as a team. And so I'm working on a variation right now where the team has to defend against the attackers, and the attackers are coming just as driven by the game. So by turning those elements over, turning over the types of attackers. And so that allows more collaboration and conversation among multiple defenders rather than just the head-on version that I showed here.
So it sounds like a game of bridge, but for war on steroids, where you have, how would it work? Is it pairs of people, or is it, many attackers?
Yeah. So what I've been working on with this is that through every iteration where you would turn over the attacker's card, for example. So let's say you have the stack of attackers here. As you turn these over, if the attacker, for example, is able to compromise or beat out the asset that's being defended, you then identify what type of loss it would be. It's either loss of integrity, availability, or confidentiality.
Okay.
And once you've suffered all three loss types, then the game ends. And the score is determined by how many assets you were able to play and defend versus how many the adversary was able to compromise. And so if you want to get a higher score, you're going to need to deploy more assets, but that also means that there's a possibility of the attackers being able to compromise more of those as well. So what it does is it enables a conversation played by, and you need to have two or more people on the other side of how are they going to build the resources, how are they going to build the defenses, and then with the NIST framework, because it is layered, one of the options of it is that you have to deploy one control from each level, each domain, control category of the framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover.
Oh, that's really good. I'm looking forward to that evolution, version 2.0 already. Shall we take some questions from the audience, so to speak? Okay, so first question that we've got, it came up a little bit earlier. For those of us that are not based in the US, can we substitute NIST with, e.g., ISO or another framework?
Absolutely. I appreciate that question. So I have one variation that I did for a financial institution that they based theirs on the CIS controls. That was their core framework.
Right.
So you could do this with the ISO 27001 family. I haven't built one of those yet, but I think I'd be happy to have that discussion. And then there's I could see it also applying within energy or sector-specific organizations, and that could be within the energy sector, C2M2, within the specific elements of the financial sector, like the PCI program, or the FFIEC's guidebook, anywhere where you're needing to explain the need to balance your attacker strength with the controls that you would need to have deployed, that's where you would be able to apply this. And then having the assets and the consequences just makes it tangible.
So let's take ISO 27001 in the revision of 2013. And it's got, from memory, 114 controls. How would that then look like in terms of a deck?
Well, so they still break into control families, right? So in there you
Correct.
have access controls. And so within each one of those access controls, it doesn't get down to, it's only at the next level down that it starts to get into the specific control elements.
Got it.
And that one tends to be too much for a card deck to take on. So I think there are 13 different categories, but it really only, I think there's really just 9 that it starts with the ISMS, and that fits in kind of the risk management function first. And then going through the different ISO, I'm thinking through the table of contents there, the different ISO control families, then you're able to break it out into those sub-functions. So you would want to piece those together in a way to make a comprehensive control catalog, but it doesn't need to be as extensive.
You wouldn't be working at the control per control level, but you'd be looking at the category, the domain, and what are the key controls in there for an ISO 27001 version.
That's right. I mean, the NIST framework, I think, has 120 something odd different controls underneath it as well. So that's why this only goes to the control families and then the subcontrols.
Very good. So another question, we got this one by email. Do you feel that cards lend themselves more to people already in security positions, for instance, red, blue, purple team, to people in related roles such as applications developers, etc., or are there different versions of the game that better suit different audiences?
I think it's a great question, because if we go back to kind of the first slide that I had, playing it both with like your kids versus cybersecurity experts, the game is high level enough that you can use it with both. Because if you play with your spouse and maybe they're not in the cybersecurity field, they're still paying attention to the numbers. They're still thinking about the different types of attackers. And that's where conversations come up like, I didn't think about just making an error was a type of attack. I didn't think about, there's this insider that might try to cause harm, all the way to the other end of it, where you're able to start applying controls, and you talk about different types of control failures. And so you start to have conversations of, well, I'll just pick one at random, right? My identity and access management happens to be really strong, but I know that I need to improve the mechanisms for detecting anomalies.
Right.
And so it prompts the conversation on known weaknesses that you already have in your environment and ways to address that. So it gets played in different ways based off of it. And you can kind of tell, because there's one of two things that the player will do. They'll either look at all the cards and look at the point numbers and say, oh, okay, I kind of get it. Or they will start laying them out next to each other, looking for ones that they already recognize and have in their systems. So the more sophisticated players will want to lay it all out and say, okay, I've got some of this, do I have supply chain and what don't I have? And it's an indicator of, how much that person looking at it from a robustness of their cyber defense program, or is it just a deck of cards?
Yes. And effectively you have, if within your organization you have a really cool red team and their capability is, super amazing, there's nothing preventing you from really just crossing out whatever is the default number for the red team card or equivalent process, if we can call it that, and then just substituting that with the number that you think is more adequate. That's all about the card deck customization. Very good. A much simpler question. We got it through live chat. Where can we buy the card deck, and does it come with instructions? And I think you've got a very good answer
Oh,
there.
yeah, absolutely. So if you just go to my website, sizzlewise.com,
Hmm.
I've got the card decks there for $20. I'm not trying to make profit on this. I'm trying to just get this out, and I ship them out to you. And then I also have a game board that you can download,
And the
which is a
placemat as well.
more sophisticated game. Yeah, the one that we had mentioned already, right?
Right.
And then kind of it walks through those instructions for you on there. I actually
Yeah.
don't have published out like the war instructions. That's actually a good suggestion. That maybe I need to add that onto the website. Is here's how you can play it with your kids in a more simple way.
Very good. And we'll include those links also in the description of the YouTube live event after we finish here, so that you've got them all in one place, everyone. Um, I've definitely gone in there and purchased my deck of cards, and um, it wasn't it was just a normal payment of sort of $20 or plus some shipping. So I don't think there's anyone here trying to make money on that. Very good. Those are all the questions that we have. Let me just do a final check. Last question from me, Earl. I think uh, having seen you go through the journey of development for this card deck, the respective framework plugin, and also how it simplifies cyber risk modeling, is there anything that you would change in your journey with the balanced attacker model now that you've kind of come full circle with it? Or are you happy with how it's evolved over time?
No, I'm not. I'm never happy with it. I'm not. So it's actually a great
Okay.
question. Um, because one thing that I learned, and I appreciate the question someone asked before about other frameworks, is this is very easy to overcomplicate. And every time I try to build it into a model or build it into using something that is overly complicated, it starts to break down. So it works well as a communication tool. If you want to do more sophisticated cyber risk modeling, that's where you're going to want to start to get into some more sophisticated simulation tools and simulation programs and other elements like that. So it's only useful up to a point where if you get into more specifics and things like that, it breaks down. But if I were to model it, and I have previous versions where I've tried doing this, to get into a more granular element, you lose the recombination ability. You lose the discovery piece of it. And that, going back to the ants model, ants are very simple creatures. And they're able to have very complex outcomes and very complex scenarios that are very survivable and resilient. And so keeping this simple follows the same approach, and just giving the right elements to be able to build from it. And then the interesting things that show up are all the different ways that it's combined and changed around. So, I kind of learned that and pulled back from it. But keeping it simple is kind of the good advice that I would give myself, and that is where the current iteration of the deck has landed. The version that the placemat, I think, is still too complex. So that's where I'm still working to improve that and simplify it.
I think simple always takes time, but you see it in the end and you say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Good response. Earl, I'd like to thank you today for your time and explaining to us the balanced attacker model. It's been fascinating to be able to just draw cards and simulate different types of risk, and also walk through the more elevated ways that this can be used for the enterprise for different scenarios. I've definitely learned a lot from this, and I can't wait for the next iteration of the deck that involves multiplayer, if I can call it that.
Yeah, the collaborative play. I'm looking forward to it as well. So look forward to playing it with you.
All right. To you and to our audience, thank you for the live event today. If there are no further questions, I'd like to thank you for participating as well, and look forward to welcoming you to our next Cyber Risk Engineering YouTube live event. Bye for now.